Still with us is Dr. Obasi, a geneticist and research scientist, as well as founder of 54Gene. Well, Dr. thank you for staying with us. Shortly, we will also join Dr. Peter Obi Adigwe in our Abuja studio. But before we join Dr. Adigwe in Abuja, I would like to ask you, you said earlier that 54Gene is now part of the testing process in Nigeria, which is very good to hear, because previously we had heard that, it's been mainly a process that had been controlled and managed by the Nigeria Center for Disease Control. But how about private hospitals? How about, other stakeholders in the process? If COVID-19 is likely to go on, as you indicated earlier, for much longer, shouldn't we develop the capacity of private hospitals and also general hospitals, even all the way to the primary healthcare level, to ensure that testing can be far more accessible?
So, yes, is the short answer to that. And so, one of the things that Lagos State did recently, which I really liked, was to decentralize, where you could go to get your samples done in. They took it closer to the individuals, made sure that people in different LGAs or LCDAs in Lagos State had, access to at least to testing, so that was good. But I should also note that because of what we are facing, because of this COVID-19, the fact that it's a virus threat, it's always going to be controlled. Even when private entities come into the fight, there still has to be some control, right? Because without that control, you can't keep track of what is happening. You can't take in measures that need to protect everyone. But I agree with you. We need to use all the capacity we have in this country, and whether that's private hospitals that are willing to fight against COVID, because not all private hospitals, mind you, would want to fight against COVID, because not all private hospitals have the capacity to fight against COVID, right? But for wherever that there is capacity and there is a willingness, we need to start looking at how we can incorporate all of those into the fight.
Certainly, Dr. Obasi and Obong, thank you so much for those thoughts. Now we're going to join in on our conversation, and it hasn't been long since President Muhammadu Buhari actually challenged the Nigerian Institutes for Pharmaceutical and Research Development to explore herbal medicine for a possible medical solution to COVID-19 in the country. So shortly we're going to be joined from our Abuja studio by Dr. Obi Adigwe, the Director General of that institute, and in course of that conversation we'll be asking him about how possible it is to tackle this onerous challenge despite the traditional problems that come with it. But what are your thoughts on that particular matter at hand?
I mean, I know that sometimes we look at drug discovery as very easy, but it's not, right? So there's different stages involved. The part of having herbal, approaches to target the COVID-19, yes, that's fine, but you still need to do the underlying biology to know what the herbal treatment should target, right? And so in drug discovery, there's a part called target discovery, where you try to understand what can bind, what the target is, and then you now look for a molecule that can bind to that target and effect a change. So basically, it either upregulates or downregulates a protein, or basically saying it could cause the increased production or decreased production of a protein, which is how most drugs work. And then after that has happened, you take it to animal studies where you try that compound in like a mice or sometimes in a primate before it even gets into clinical trials. So that there is a long stage. And I do hope that we do have very good herbal compounds that we could test. But we also need to understand what the biology is to know what that herbal compound is testing, to also prevent side effects from happening, because you could have a situation where a compound binds to a target, it effects a change, but it then causes other side effects. And that's because of lack of specificity of target and compound binding. So I think that that's all well and good, but we still need to do the underlying biology, and we need to improve the capability of understanding the biology of disease, and then we can bring in herbal compounds.
Well, Dr. Ene Obong, when all of this started, one of the first interventions we had in Nigeria was Professor Maurice Iwo, saying that he had come up with a formula, and he tried to relate with the appropriate agencies of government. Since then, we have also had other interventions. The ASU, the Academic Staff Union of Universities, says there are Nigerian researchers who have the capacity to be able to come up with a vaccine or make an import. We have also had pastors and all kinds of persons saying that, well, the solution, the way forward, is anointing oil or holy water or whatever, or maybe herbal compounds, as recommended by some traditional rulers. Now, do we really have the capacity in Nigeria for research? Do we have the relevant institutions to be able to make a contribution, as we have seen perhaps in Senegal and some other countries, at least they're making the effort? Do we have the capacity here? Because government talks about research into vaccine development. Do we, in your own assessment, have the capacity?
We do have capacity. I will mention certain groups that have capacity. Professor Happy's lab, which is the African Centers for Excellence for Infectious Diseases, they have very good capacity. Redeemers University has very good capacity. You know, the NIMA, which is led by Professor Tunde Salako, has good capacity. In fact, Professor Nash, who leads Centers for Genomics Research at NABDA, has good capacity. In fact, they have even started working on repurposing drugs for potential use against things like COVID-19 and Lassa fever. The only issue is that they haven't received the funding. So I can tell you about Professor Nash's work. Professor Nash, you know, even before most other groups started doing clinical trials on COVID-19 to repurpose drugs that have already been approved for other indications, for other diseases for COVID-19, Professor Nash and his team did their own internal research, you know, ran compounds against a database, and they came up with some of the same drugs that other groups internationally had come up with for repurposing. Now, all they needed was funding to take those drugs and either take it to animal studies, or because those drugs have been seen as safe, and because this is like a virus pandemic, they could take that straight into clinical human trials. There was no funding for that. And so we need to start thinking about how does government begin to fund the brilliant scientists in the country. NIMA currently produces the media that we use to, when we collect the samples from patients, the virus. The media, which is like the solution you put it in to store and keep that virus alive so that you can test, is produced in National Institute of Medical Research in Lagos. NIMA has other production capabilities to do tests, diagnostic tests. You know, they've been doing HIV research. We have those capabilities in the country. What we don't have is support for those brilliant scientists.
We can only appeal to get more support and more support for our scientists. Now, I think it's also interesting to note that the African genome is said to be the most genetically diverse in the world. Doctor, do you want to tell us how and why this is, and maybe also give us some information on your biobank as well?
Sure. So, I mean, African genome has a lot of variation, and some of that is because modern humans, now if you believe in evolution, modern humans originated from Africa about 200,000 years ago, right? Which means that Africa has been the oldest living abode for modern humans. Now, it's believed that humans migrated out of Africa in batches, and as they migrated out of Africa, there's what you call a bottleneck effect. So imagine a bottle and the neck of a bottle. And essentially what that means is that the groups that migrated out of the continent took just a little bit of the genetic variation out of the continent, leaving a lot of genetic variation within Africa. Now, variation is what we use to understand why certain people respond to treatments better, right? Why certain people have side effects when they take a drug and another person does not have that same side effect. It's also what we use to discover which pathways, which biological pathways are needed to switch or change so that you can have a drug. Now, one of the things you can see in Africa is the social demographic, social cultural patterns of living, where you've had for, if you believe in the 200,000 years story, where you've had groups of people living together and marrying themselves alone for quite a long time. Many of us know that, you know, about 1 or 2 generations ago, our parents did not marry outside of their tribes, right? So it was difficult to see an Efik, which I am, getting married to someone from Delta, which my mother is. Back in the day, my dad's people will marry only his people, and my mom's people will marry only their people. And that lack of intermarriage did what we conserved whatever genetic variation different groups had, right? So if the Efiks had a genetic variation, that meant they did not have, high blood pressure. They conserved it within themselves without sharing it with some other group, right? And so because of that long, closed, sociocultural system, we have conserved variation in pockets. The other thing is, even when you look at the languages spoken on the continent, now studies have shown that linguistic groups also have genetic variation because people who typically speak a language live together for long periods of time. Nigeria alone has more than 300 languages, which we believe means that there is quite a lot of variation in Nigeria compared to even other parts of Africa. And so by being able to understand this genetic variation on the continent, we believe that we might understand diseases better, and not just for Nigerians and Africans, but for people all over the world. And we might be able to find better diagnostics and drugs for certain diseases.
Well, Dr. Obong, let me bring you back again to policy and the point you made about funding gap for research in Nigeria. Now, at a time like this, when we have a crisis on our hands, and government saying it is willing to encourage research and development and all of that, what do you think is responsible for this funding gap? Is it lack of political will on the part of government, or lack of capacity to understand the urgency of now with regard to COVID-19? Considering the fact that the private sector has contributed so much money, we hear the figures, and then again we hear that nobody is funding anything. What would be your advice to policymakers in this regard?
So in Nigeria, at least in the Nigeria I grew up in, because research does not provide any immediate outcomes, research is really not valued. We don't look past the next few years. So one, I think it's a cultural thing. I think that we have sort of gotten to this point as a people where we don't think few years ahead. There's a story about how the Japanese started competing with the Americans in terms of car production, where once upon a time America held all the capabilities and power, and Japan was really just making motorcycles. But Japan had to look at how do we fund research and look at a 20-year horizon whereby we can achieve and even exceed the market over 20 years. And they made the investment that gave them one of the biggest car industries in the world today. I think that's how we have to look at it these days in science. We have to start looking 10, 20 years down the line. We need our leaders to understand the need to fund research. Both political capital, now there's no political capital, there's no real political capital when you say we have put $10 million to fund drug repurposing research, right? Because most of the population in Nigeria don't understand what that is, right? So where a politician gets political capital is where they go and build a hospital, right? So they have this big shining white building called a hospital. And people can see it from outside and say, oh, they did this in their time. But if you go into those buildings, it's like a graveyard. There is no thought about what about putting the right instrumentation inside. And that's why we're having this whole problem about ventilators. Because we've had lots of politicians build great big edifices, but have not put in the right instrumentation that helps save lives, that helps to save lives. And so, we need to begin to recalculate what political capital is, and stop doing things like expedient, and also start thinking about our generation, our kids, our progeny. How would they benefit from what we've done? If we put up a building and nothing is inside, there is no benefit. Yes, you get the next election, but you've not done anything for the people.
Well, at this point, we're going to join Dr. Peter Obi Adigwe, Director General of the Nigeria Institute for Pharmaceutical and Research Development in Abuja. Dr. Adigwe, are you with us? Good morning.
Good morning, Doctor.
Yes. Morning.
Dr. Adigwe, good morning. Yes, we've been having a very long conversation with Dr. Obasi, who has been very kind with his time this morning with us on the morning show. And before you joined us, we were talking about research and development. You are Director General of a relevant institute that has been asked by stakeholders and also by the federal government to make a contribution to the research in finding a solution to COVID-19 in Nigeria. What is your institute doing? Are you handicapped in any way? Are you facing any challenges? Is government just making statements without really connecting with the relevant stakeholders?
So, right from when the outbreak got to Nigeria, in fact, even before the outbreak got to Nigeria, we looked at the various areas where NIPRID could contribute to taking care of ensuring that the outbreak is controlled. And one of the very few things that we started with was ensuring that commodities, supply chains of commodities which are necessary to disrupt the spread of the virus were available. We quickly put up a database of local manufacturers that produce hand sanitizers. As you're aware, one of the evidence-based means of preventing transmission is washing your hands with soap and water, and in the absence of soap and water, using an alcohol-based hand sanitizer or hand rub. So we're able to put together that database, and when it appeared that there was a scarcity of that particular product, NIPRID also went into the laboratory and product developed a sample. We've gone ahead to now register that particular product with NAFDAC, and that product is now available. So on the one hand, we ensured that we were able to contribute significantly to making sure that commodities and various different relevant interventions that will prevent the spread was available. But more importantly, getting to the stage now that we need to start looking at the curative aspect, NIPRID has also put the pedal to the metal to ensure that there's certain products that are coming out from Nigeria that can help with taking care of COVID-19 when someone finally gets it. And we've developed an immunomodulatory agent, which basically is something that boosts the immune system of anyone who is either at risk of getting COVID-19 or already has COVID-19. And this increases the chances of that individual surviving the disease if they catch it. We've also started to work with partners in looking at the different interventions. There are various products that have been mentioned as having potential viability in treatment of COVID-19, which are being looked at scientifically across the world in clinical trials. We're talking to a number of partners in Nigeria now to undertake those same or similar clinical trials in Nigeria, but ensuring that the clinical trials that are designed for COVID-19 in Nigeria fit into the Nigerian context. We're also working with partners in ensuring that other various local interventions that can help are brought to the market very quickly. Locally produced ventilators. There's a government agency that has approached us to partner with ensuring that the locally produced ventilators is safe, is effective, and it can get to the market very quickly. The disinfectant devices also that have been approached to partner with some of these agencies to bring to the market. So there's quite a lot going on in NIPRID. As regards your other question, which is whether we have challenges, yes, we have challenges. A major challenge is funding. I think I caught the tail end of your discourse with the previous contributor.
Dr. Enea
And I agree with some of the things he mentioned in terms of funding. But where I would differ slightly with him is the fact that a lot of people seem to push the buck for funding in research and development to government. Yes, government has a role to play. There's no doubt about that. But funding and investment in research and development is everybody's business. This century, the biggest discovery, the most groundbreaking discovery in antibiotic resistance happened in MIT just a few weeks ago. And it was the Jamil Center that partnered with MIT that came up with halicin, which is a blockbuster, well, potentially blockbuster medicine that can be used for tackling over 35 microorganisms, which previously had demonstrated significant resistance to almost all existing antibiotics. And that's in America. America and China are number 1 and 2 in funding research across the world. Yet, in America, you have private sectors, you have philanthropists partnering with already rich universities to sponsor research. That is what we're not seeing enough of in Nigeria. And I think time now is for everybody to contribute. If COVID-19 comes into this room, for instance, it won't ask who works for government and who works for private sector. It affects everybody. So everybody who has the means and who wants to ensure that our response to COVID-19 is wholesome and adopts a big picture approach, a proactive approach, a long-term approach, needs to chip in right now.
Dr. Adigwe, thank you for sharing your initial thoughts. Let's move over back to Dr. Enea and get your thoughts on what has just been said, that a lot of people push the bulk to governments, but really and truly it's everybody's business. What is your take on this? Okay, so
yes, Dr. Adigwe, it's nice to meet you. I agree that everybody has a role to play. I mean, I run a company that is a private company that is funding research in Nigeria. And we need more private sector players, I agree. And, this is not to shift blame, but I think at the same time, we all need to ask, are we doing enough? Yes, we need more private sector players. When we've been trying to raise funds, we find that more often than not, and this is not just for the healthcare sector, you have more foreign, institutions or global institutions making the investments rather than even VC firms in Nigeria, right? So we need to increase that. But when you look at the public side, the US's National Institutes of Health has a budget of more than $1 trillion to fund research, right? They are the biggest funder of research in the US. And the issue is that, yes, you have private funders, but you have this interplay where private groups and public groups come together to fund research. The current vaccine, the first vaccine to get into human trial, which is by a company called Moderna, actually has US funding attached to it and private funding. Moderna worked hand in hand with the US's CDC, was one of the first to get their vaccine up and running, at least for trials, and just recently got a grant from US's BARDA for close to $500 million. Right, so, I mean, yes, private sector has to work, but we also need government and public sector to work. And I'm not going to, I mean, I haven't seen much of public sector funding. We need to begin to see that. That's what I'm saying.
Well, Dr. Adigwe, let me come back to you now. And this has to do with the question I raised with Dr. Ene Obong earlier. And it has to do with the intervention of Professor Maurice Iwo. When he said he and his team had discovered a vaccine or a solution to COVID-19. What we were told later by the Ministry of Science and Technology and the Minister of Health was that what was proposed by Professor Iwo had been sent to the United States for further checks. Now, where are we with that right now? I mean, you are involved in pharmaceutical research. Have you... Your agency, that is, has your agency been involved in that process of trying to follow up on Professor Iwo's recommendation and see how that can be part of Nigeria's contribution to the search for a solution to COVID-19?
So my agency is a government agency under the Ministry of Health. And one of the weaknesses that government agencies have, which I will readily acknowledge anywhere, is the amount of bureaucracy that sometimes impedes, an expedited reaction to these kind of issues. Unfortunately, we have not received any communication officially from Professor Maurice Iwo. So NIPRID is not looking into Professor Maurice Iwo's claims. However, I'd just like to bring it to your attention that Professor Maurice Iwo's claim, whilst being very widely publicized, is not the only claim. Since COVID-19 started, I've gotten somewhere close to 150 calls or submissions or text messages from people who play in that same field. Professor Maurice Iwo's intervention, from what I read in the newspapers, is of phytomedicinal origin. And like I said, even though his is the most widely publicized, it's not the only one. We've gotten close to 150.
For the benefit of our viewers,
out of the 150.
Dr. Adigwe, for the benefit of our viewers, phytomedicinal means it's plant-based? Is that what it means?
Yes, it's plant-based. The origins are from the flora, which is found naturally here in Nigeria. And out of the 150, ideally, if NIPRID had the funding that it deserves, which we have been calling out for years, ideally there should be a pool, for NIPRID to be able to screen these 150 submissions and then say categorically that product A, B, and C out of the 150 have potential to contribute to addressing COVID-19. Unfortunately, NIPRID doesn't have those kind of funds. The research that goes into categorically claiming that a product has intervention is significant. You first have to do preclinical tests, and preclinical is divided into in vitro, there's in vivo, and more recently there is the in silico model. Some of these products have to pass through all three different preclinical tests, right? For each of these clinical tests, for instance, in silico, you have to pass your phytomedicines through various types of media, aqueous media, alcoholic media, and then after passing through the preclinical phase, then you get to the clinical phase. The clinical phase is where you have the clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. Phase 1 looks at the safety of the intervention that you're bringing to the book. Phase 2 and phase 3 look at the efficacy and the reactions that, potential side effects, effects on different demographics. And then phase 4 is after that product has been approved. So it's a long process, and frankly, it's an expensive process. The average sum it takes in the developed world to bring a product from inception to phase 4 of clinical trials is somewhere between $15 and $50 million. Since I was appointed Director General of NIPRID, I don't think we've gotten anywhere close to that amount. So regarding the potential of Professor Iwu's submission, I can neither validate or say whether where that particular intervention is at. However, I can tell you categorically that there is significant potential in phytomedicines contributing to addressing the COVID-19 scourge. NIPRID already has a product, like I said, that can act as an immunomodulator in COVID-19. That's a significant intervention, and that particular intervention is also of phytomedicinal origin. Now, what we have now started to do is to tell the 150 people who've reached out to us, okay, currently NIPRID doesn't have the fund to bear the cost of screening your 150. What do we do? For some of them, we've now started putting together joint grant applications so that NIPRID and the owner of the phytomedicinal intervention can now apply for a grant either internally or externally. And then when the funds come, NIPRID can now process it and then get that product validated for the phytomedicinal owner. One of those 150, we've just put together an MOU, and we're working towards putting a grant application. We just actually finished the management meeting for that particular product yesterday.
Dr. Adigwe, thank you for these clarifications that you've given. They're certainly helpful. And we're going to come back to you in just a moment. There's a statement now, Dr. Obong, that you made at a point in time that I'd like to bring up. I'd like to get more analysis from you on, and then let's see how Dr. Adigwe also reacts to it. You were quoted as saying that beyond even vaccines for gene sequencing or gene sequencing for vaccines, that even drugs are not made with Africans in mind. And of course, what we know is that what we see across Africa are a lot of generics being used. So what effect has this had on us as Africans over time?
Okay, so I used to work in the US for a company that consulted for the big drug manufacturers. And one of my jobs was to tell global pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, etc., how they should launch their new medicines for cancers or diabetes or whatever. And one of the things I would always see by combing through the data was that, one, Africa was typically not included in their marketing plans. The part of Africa that was included was mostly South Africa. Two, what that meant, too, was that innovative medicines came to Africa at the point that those medicines were going generic. Now, it's good to understand that there's two different types of drugs. You have branded drugs, and these are drugs that still have their patents. And a patent for a drug can last for 10 to 18 years. And in some cases, companies get patent extensions, which can give them exclusivity for 22 years. What that means is that for up to 22 years, a particular manufacturer, a drug company, can decide where they want to sell their medicines. And typically they will go to the places that give them the most money. Now, what we found as well was that when a drug then gets generic, so basically they've lost their patent exclusion, and we then have generic companies in Nigeria, India, China getting the license, those drugs then come into Nigeria. So sometimes innovative medicines take 10 to 20 years to get into Nigeria. Right, so we are like 10 to 20 years behind the innovation curve. We're beginning to see some companies buck this trend. We see companies that are looking at bringing drugs now to Nigeria, say 5 years after they've launched. Now, what all of this means is that until we start doing our own research and coming up with our own innovative compounds, or until we have better marketing mechanisms, we won't be the first to get the best medicines in the country. And so, yes, we have a generic industry, and what a generic company does is they get a license and reproduce. But we need to begin to create the intellectual property behind some of these drugs. And to Dr. Adigwe's point, it requires a lot of money. In fact, there are some studies that show that it takes about $1 billion to bring a drug to market. That's on average. Sometimes it costs $100 million in full, sometimes it's $500 million, but we need to have companies, private companies and public companies that are funded and also have the desire to actually go into the research and innovate around new drugs.
Well, Dr. Obong, let's stay with you. I have a question for you and also a question for Dr. Adigwe. I mean, you are already part of the testing network for Lagos and Ogun State. That's 54 Gene, your company. Now, you are hoping also that later you will be involved in Kano. What exactly do you think is going on in Kano? Because there's some confusion. There's no clarity as to what is going on. The federal government is saying one thing. The state government is saying another thing. The Minister of Health says investigation is ongoing. Are we dealing with COVID-19, or we're dealing with a different kind of pandemic in Kano State where over 640 persons have died since April 11? And for you, Dr. Adigwe, you talked about 150 groups that have contacted NIPRID. Now, part of that 150, you talked about phytomedicine, but how about these pastors, herbalists, and all kinds of persons in Nigeria who say they have anointing oil, they have holy water? Have you also had cause to engage all these holy water and anointing oil solution providers? Is that part of the science? Maybe Dr. Obong, you go first.
Well, I believe your question is Kano is it COVID-19 or is it something else in Kano? Was that the question?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I cannot at this point say what it is because I would want for the data to tell us. But I think that we should have it at the back of our mind that as we are fighting COVID-19, we're also fighting Lassa fever, and it's also the meningitis season as well. Right, so it could be any one of those things. It could be a combination of those things. But I don't have the data specifics yet, and until we get into Kano and start providing tests, will we really know? But we need to look at all the various things that are happening in Kano right now in terms of the various potential diseases and the presentation of symptoms, because they vary by symptoms.
Dr. Adigwe?
Yes. So, Ruben, before I answer your question, I'd like to completely agree with Dr. Obong that the assertion that internationally drugs are produced without Africans and development people who live in developing countries in mind is completely true. I couldn't agree more with that statement. A few years ago, there was an analysis that was done which found that somewhere under, I think, a figure under 5% of all funding interventions into medicines were targeting diseases that were prevalent in tropical areas. Obviously, it's Africa and then South America that makes up most of the tropics, and we need to begin as a people, and I mean Africans and South Americans, to understand the importance of the concept of medicine security. Unless you're able to determine how your medicines are made, the type of research and development that's undertaking in your environment, which is focused on diseases that are prevalent in your own setting, you will not be able to completely ensure that you can provide sustainable access to high-quality healthcare, affordable healthcare for your people. And this is something that we have argued for years. When the meningitis scourge came up, when we had an outbreak of meningitis a few years ago, we were one of the first people that called out for the establishment of a strong vaccines manufacturing entity in Nigeria. Prior to that, we didn't have anything in that line. And thank goodness this administration took that on board. And then this administration had a PPP, public-private partnership with a local manufacturing company. And I think it was the total amount of 6 billion. And we've now moved further along the value chain in terms of manufacturing vaccines. It is critical. Again, when Ebola came up, we brought up this argument. You cannot keep depending on people who live in the global north to produce medicines for you in the global south. You need to build your capacity. Yesterday and the day before, people have inundated my WhatsApp and my social media team with the clips of an intervention in Senegal, and I think Ruben, you mentioned it earlier on. Now let's look at the figures. Senegal, as a percentage of their GDP, contributes focuses on 4 times the amount of Nigeria as a percentage of their GDP does to research and development. Senegal, as a people, per capita, has up to 10 times of STEM researchers in the same area.
Dr. Obong, we've run out of time. Unfortunately, Dr. Adigwe, you couldn't get to the part about, the pastors and the herbalists trying to engage in this problem that we are all facing. We want to thank you very much, and Dr. Enebong, thank you very much. You've been very kind.
Thank you for joining us.
And Dr. Adigwe, thank you for joining us also.